Hello, everyone. Welcome to the ICA. I am Nora Burnett-Abrams, the ICA's Ellen Matilda Poss Director, and I'm thrilled to be here with all of you for the artist's voice, Derrick Adams and Salamishah Tillet. We are so grateful for the opportunity today to listen, learn from, and gain deeper insights into Derrick's practice and background, all of which are on such vivid display in his exhibition upstairs, Derrick Adams, Viewmaster. The exhibition brings together over 2 decades of work in wide-ranging media and celebrates what Derrick does best: engages with popular culture, centers leisure, freedom, and the pursuit of happiness, celebrates the beauty of everyday life and the richness and complexity of Black culture. Today's program would not have been possible without the generosity of the ICA's many friends and supporters, and I'd first like to recognize our program sponsor. This event was made possible in part by the Bridget and Bruce Evans Public Program Fund, and we thank them sincerely for their dedication to the ICA's public programming. I would also like to extend a very special thank you to Monica Garza, the Charlotte Wagner Director of Education here at the ICA, and production manager Danny Abugatis, as well as Joe Williams and Michelle Walker on the production crew. Thank you also to Amy Ham, Brittany Fletcher, and Debbie Burke, who are overseeing this afternoon's book signing, which is immediately following the talk. I'd also like to thank the donors who there are so many of you. Thank you. That is such a great situation to be in. The donors and sponsors for the exhibition, who are recognized up here on this slide, and whose partnership really helped us to realize this monumental mid-career survey of Derrick's work, including our first facade commission outside. My sincere thanks go to guest curator Dexter Wimberly and his co-curator, ICA's assistant curator Tessa Bacci-Haas, for their incredible work in bringing this exhibition to life, along with ICA's Barbara Lee, chief curator and director of curatorial affairs, Ruth Erickson. We also share such deep gratitude with Alyssa Alexander, the studio manager at Derrick Adams Studio, for her vital collaboration, because as you can imagine, Derrick is a man of the world, and getting him into this building on this date is no easy feat, and we are so grateful that we made it all work. So now, I am so honored to introduce our featured speakers. Derrick Adams is based in Brooklyn, and he is a multidisciplinary artist and a tenured associate professor at the School of Visual Media and Performing Arts at CUNY Brooklyn College. Beyond his studio practice, Derrick has founded Charm City Cultural Cultivation in Baltimore, which is a nonprofit with a mission to empower underrepresented Black creatives, foster community collaboration, and preserve local history. Adams' work has been exhibited nationwide and is held in the permanent collections of many museums, including the Met, the Whitney, and the Studio Museum in Harlem. A scholar, writer, and activist, Salamishah Tillet was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism in 2022 for her work as a contributing critic at large for the New York Times, where she has been writing since 2015. She is the author of In Search of the Color Purple, The Story of an American Masterpiece, and Sites of Slavery, Citizenship and Racial Democracy in the Post-Civil Rights Imagination. Tillet is also the Distinguished Professor of Creative Writing and Africana Studies and the Executive Director of Express Newark, a center for socially engaged art and design at Rutgers University. Upon arriving at Rutgers, she founded New Arts Justice, a public art studio in the city of Newark, and with her sister, Scheherazade Tillet, she founded A Long Walk Home, an arts organization that empowers young people to end violence against girls and women. Just a little bit of business. Following our conversation, I invite you to join our speakers on the stage for a book signing. The museum remains open today until 5 p.m., and I sure hope that you have a chance to ride on one of the Fun Time unicorn sculptures outside before you leave. Now, what we've all been waiting for, I'm so happy to hand it over to Derrick and Salamishah. Thank you.
So I was just saying, I've never been on one of those unicorns.
You got to get on it.
Yeah,
You got to get on
so all of us can get on it today. I just want to say thank you for inviting me to be in conversation with you and for me being in conversation with Derrick. I'm from Boston, as you know, so it's always a wonderful experience to return back to the place that so much of my relationship to visual culture and African-American cultural identity was born. So we have slides for everyone.
Hello, everybody. Hello. Hi. I'm happy to be here.
So I've had the opportunity to curate Derrick twice. And so we'll talk a little bit about those experiences. But I actually first became acquainted with your work through my sister Scheherazade, who has been a fan of yours and interlocutor for many years. And you were one of the first pieces that when I got my advance for my book on Nina Simone, you were the first works of art that I consciously started collecting. And so
I didn't know that.
Yeah, you didn't know that? Okay,
No.
well, there you go.
Okay, cool.
But I'm really excited, and I had an opportunity to write about him, so I'm just really excited to be in a public conversation with Derrick, even though it probably will feel like we're just having lunch together. So one of the things I want to just talk about, and I write about this in your book, is the gaze and the multiple gazes that you're invoking, challenging. But why this title? Let's just begin with the beginning of the show itself. And why a viewmaster? What does that mean to you?
Well, the title comes from the redesign of the Viewmaster, which Charles Harrison, who was a product designer, hired for this company to reimagine the toy, not as just a collectible, but as something that could be accessible for many different people. And it became really interesting to me that this particular person who existed during pre and post civil rights era was able to create something that imagined a world of accessibility in a time where things were not accessible. So the fact that this person who was a designer, the first Black person to work for this company, a person who dealt with a lot of probably challenges and obstacles, was still able to have this idea of play or the idea of considering someone who would be using it would think about it in play through a time where he probably was not able to play as much, became fascinating to me. But I learned this information when I first was invited to curate one of the first shows at Stony Island Arts Bank in Chicago, the After Gate Space. And so when he first opened it, he started to begin a visual arts program, and he asked me to install exhibition. And so I used the archive from the Jet magazine, Ebony, and Jet, the Johnson publication, research material. And from that, I pulled a lot of information that I started to be more attracted to, which was items that were talking about product design. And it was happening the same time as a space race. So it was like this other parallel world of Black American culture and advertising, talking about some of the same things that was being talked about in a bigger mainstream. And I thought it was really interesting to focus on that as a subject for the body of work that I created, was called Future People. And it was using the science of, in the technology era at that particular time, during the civil rights era, to be kind of the source for that work. And this was one of the things that I discovered doing research. And that's how it ended up being in my brain. Because I realized there's so many things that have been designed and created by Black Americans in our society that it would be almost virtually impossible to really be racist. I mean, you still can be, what I'm saying, but there's so many things that have been created, like the spatula, the heater that people use.
Traffic light.
Like it's so many things that, like, don't use any of those things. So for me, it was also an awakening because I was so infatuated with some of these objects that I learned were designed by people who had similar cultural experiences that I had. So just as a source of just content and context, that usually is a driving force from most of my work. Like, there's so many different layers of what motivates me to focus on things that are not always transferable to the viewer, but it's not always my concern that the viewer has a literal understanding of what I'm making. It's really more about, does that object activate a sense of curiosity to want to know to me, that's the most important part of making, not having people start from knowing.
Okay, so wow, I did not know any of that. So that's really compelling, because I'm thinking of the ViewMaster kind of functions as both like some sort of like replication or a duplication of what we think of as real, but then you're changing your perspective simultaneously. So it's like this illusion and you know what I mean? Like,
Well, it was both. It was like I was thinking first, as an artist, because regardless of, most creative people, we start from our curiosity with formal interests. And so understanding the historical attachment was another thing that sparked my curiosity, but it was really more about thinking reflectively about the way I make art now and the things that influence my visual language. And so as an educator, I was really interested in like starting here and then going back. Like I always think about, as an artist now, what are the things that I did when I was a kid? What are the things that I saw? What are the things that I interpret? I started looking at my own experience as a reference for understanding my perspective of the way I see color, the way I see formation. And so I started to look at the ViewMaster in a more technical way, and looking at the way they layer these flat images on top of each other to create this dimensional space. And that's kind of what I do with my work. And so I think about, from understanding the technical part of the ViewMaster film and how it's constructed, I start to think about how I'm also constructing images. And so it became like this thing that just fascinated me. And it became like one of the many muses that I use in my studio when I'm making stuff. Yeah.
It's amazing. So let's think about because I know, after dinner last night, one of the things we were talking about, there are ways in which the kind of biographical information of an artist, particularly Black artists or artists of color, kind of overrides maybe their formal experimentation, right?
Yeah.
So, or sometimes and other artists are allowed to be, we've only talked about them in the realm of the formal. So let's begin with your earliest work as, well, not your earliest, because your earliest obviously goes back to your childhood, but in terms of being in art school. And I had the opportunity to interview Derrick for the piece I wrote in the book. And so let's just talk about the ways in which, like, what are we seeing here? And how does this in some ways become the basis for a lot of the ways in which you're painting, the relationship between kind of three-dimensionality and everything. It's like an aspiration almost in all of the work that you do. And so what's going on here?
So this particular work I created in my graduate year at Columbia in the MFA program. And I started off making mostly three-dimensional objects, installation and performance and video. I was not really focused as much into painting, but I did paint. But a lot of paintings that I made in my undergrad and after undergrad kind of had some level of attachment of objects as something that was pushing to be a three-dimensional thing, but it was on the wall. And so as I started to mature in my practice, I started to be more interested in what I was doing, how it existed, where did it come from, and I started to even question the things that have been put in front of me as a person, and why was it here, and what was it doing? And so when I was in grad school, a lot of conversations were centered around identity and, really looking at the relationship to representation and conceptual art, and thinking about how artists were able to navigate these two spaces of being somewhat, ambiguous in some points for some artists, but also speaking on things that were sociopolitically motivated. And so I always felt that from my previous education as an undergrad, as a BFA art and education major, and I taught elementary school for a little while, I started to realize that symbolism in any way has a level of embodiment that's imposed ideology that people buy into, and is really attached to consumerism. And consumerism, for most people, especially in American culture, our identity is attached to things that we collect around us. And even, it could be electronics, it could be clothing, whatever. It kind of situates us in a certain class or a certain level of access, or things that really help to frame who we are as people. And so when I was in grad school, I started looking at the idea of how the relationship to Black American culture and African culture from a consumerism side. And so I started to think about the idea that, if you really thought about African artifacts, like the most authentic thing would be a plate and a fork that's being used by someone in the African continent. Like to me, that would be something that's, regardless of where it's made, is being utilized and functional there. These particular objects, I was interested because they are considered African sculptures, but they're tourist sculptures, and they're Maasai Kenyan sculptures, but they were more designed for African American to be more, and tourists to be reacquainted with the history and the culture. And the clothing on these sculptures were Barbie and Ken clothes, and G.I. Joe, and Mattel. And I felt like that's the kind of relationship that African Americans or Black Americans have, is their everyday experience. Like the idea that the clothing that they're wearing is something that mirrors contemporary culture and is influenced by looking at the overall landscape of humanity in style and motion. And then the artifact is something that is also supposed to be something that you're supposed to connect to. But I felt like fusing these two things together that had these two separate ideologies would actually be more representational of how I saw myself or how I study people when I'm walking around. And so it became like more of an experiment in my studio. A lot of things that I made when I was a younger artist were not made for a gallery.
Yeah.
It was made more about working out problems or working out solutions or posing questions. And so this particular object that's mounted in my studio when I was in grad school, it would be the floor, and it was where I had my crits. So when people came to my studio, these objects were like pretty much laying around, and people would talk, we would have conversation while people were dressing the sculptures and taking things off the sculptures. And so it was like a neutralizing conversation, but I got more out of it. I got more out of the person who was speaking with me because I brought us onto the same level of conversation, because usually when you have crits, it's someone who's considered someone who is an authority on something. And so a lot of times you have crits, people come into your studio like you don't know things. And so, that's what happens a lot of times in grad school. People come into like they're coming to answer a question that, you have no idea about, instead of being engaging with you to find out where you are, what you're thinking about, And so having this sculpture, it kind of neutralized those two positions. And so sitting on the floor, we would just get into conversations about the texture, the different things about things that may or may not necessarily have been about the work, but they were beneficial to me as the artist. So when people left my studio, I was left with some level of like intellectual, nutrients that I was able to keep moving forward. And when this thing was not in my studio, it was almost like when people came to my studio, they would be coming to my studio to impose upon me what they thought I should be doing. And so with these, people had a sense of play, and so they were way more looser in my studio. And for me, I got way more out of the person who came than I did when I didn't do this.
The other thing that I know that you kind of ascribe to these sculptures, or at least partly anyway, is this kind of interest, the formal interest in maybe cubism, geometric expression, the ways, so, oftentimes when people write about your work, they're invoking the kind of great European masters, and who actually were inspired by West African or Southwest African, in this case, I guess, Maasai. So I think, there's the play aspect, there's the kind of equanimity that you're creating in that moment with the crit or whoever's visiting. And then there's kind of a formal inspiration that so here we can see in the very beginning of your idea of play, your idea of some of your color, you're dissolving the boundaries between fashion and high art and fashion, and then there's the geometric, the kind of formal geometric configurations. So I want to move a little bit to talk about, I will come back to this, but the ways in which we can see the conversation you're having in those sculptures, and then by the time you get to painting, you're still obsessed with a kind of 3D. Do you want to talk? Because I haven't seen these before until I came to the show.
Oh,
and I was
really?
like,
Okay.
I kind of like love. I love these, so I just want. Yeah, I want them myself.
I mean,
But
when
anyway,
when I was in grad school, I was really resistant into making like paintings or drawings or anything like that, because I just thought about myself as being more. I thought that art is just more like philosophy, and so I just thought that as an artist, being an artist to be famous or rich was not the motivation, because I was exposed to other artists who I thought were great, and they were not rich or famous to everybody.
Yeah.
And I thought that that's what artists do. Like if you're a philosopher or a literary person, I just thought that art was like this cool place to be in where you were just, everyone's broke and everyone's having a good time and everyone's like doing like what artists do, like putting their pennies together and doing, So I was accustomed to that thought process, and not as a negative. I thought that when I used to be young, when I was younger and I would watch like movies about artists, it would always be like someone living in like a big loft, and outside was just like trash, and like I thought like very romantically about being an artist. Like you can't pay your rent, I thought about that. So to me, art was not really a thing about like upward mobility.
Or commerce.
Yeah, commerce. I thought that it was priceless in some ways, and it's really more about like sharing ideas and hanging out with writers and musicians. I thought it was more bohemian style as an artist. So,
but that's like a good foundation.
And I was okay with that. I thought that's what I was aiming for. I thought I would be teaching, and I would just be making my art, and maybe I could get a studio somewhere, and I would hang out with my art friends, and we would just do stuff. But I didn't think about art in the way that art is kind of formed now. But when I started to work on these sculptures, the way I started drawing, I went to visit one of my friends, Robin Rode, who's an artist, South African artist who moved to Berlin, and we met at a party, and we just hit it off. Like, we met at this party, we were hanging out and talking. He was on his way to the Rijks Academy in Amsterdam, and we just talked for like an hour or so, and then we stayed in contact. And then one day he called me like 2 years later and said he started to get a lot of exposure and started selling art. And he called me. He was like, "Yo, homie," he was like, "I'm making a lot of money now. I started this nonprofit, and I want the nonprofit about bringing artists to Berlin, and I want you to be the first person to come, and I'm going to pay for you to come. I'm going to give you money. I'm going to put you in an apartment. You can be there for a month." And I was like, "What am I going to make when I'm there?" And so I took a ruler, I took some drawing paper, I went to the dollar store and I bought some printed contact paper with like wood grain and different material. And so I took it to tracing paper, and I took it to Berlin, and I started doing these small drawings of just the heads of these figures. And I was drawing it with my ruler, and I was just doing that. And then I was there for like a week, but I wasn't there to work.
Like right there?
Yeah, yes, exactly. So before I made that bigger piece there, the first image was a smaller drawing of it.
Yeah.
And I wasn't there to make work, but I always make work wherever I go.
Yeah.
If I'm there for a while. And so I carry like a little plastic portfolio case with like drawing paper and stuff. So I was just drawing when I was there, and then by the time I finished, I had like a whole series of these profile heads. And when I went back to the States, I decided just to blow them up to make these larger works that was on the back wall, and that's how the series of the geometric forms started. And it was really looking at the work I made with sculpture. I just started making these drawings. But again, it wasn't for like an exhibition. I didn't have a show or a gallery. I was just making these things.
So the geometric, I'm curious for you, why the geometric form?
In general?
Yeah,
I'm always interested in like, when I went to Pratt, a lot of the professors at Pratt were hard edge abstraction artists.
Yeah.
And so a lot of my interest in hard edge abstraction started with my exposure to that at Pratt in light, color, and design. But I also ended up at Pratt because I grew up in Baltimore, and I had to do a book report at this. First, I went to a community college for like a semester or so, and I had to do a book report, and I discovered the work of Jacob Lawrence at the public library. And I also discovered that he taught at Pratt. And even though he was no longer at Pratt, I decided to go to Pratt, looking for him. I wasn't even thinking about the dates at the time. I was just like, I got to go meet Jacob Lawrence. I got to go meet Jacob Lawrence. So I went to Pratt, and I would ask all my professors, do you know Jacob Lawrence? Did you know Jacob Lawrence?
So he was alive still when you were
Yeah,
there?
so
Oh.
yeah, so he had left Pratt long ago, probably in the 70s,
Yeah.
and he went to Seattle for full time because he didn't get a permanent position at Pratt.
Oh.
And so I finally met a professor at Pratt who said that Jacob Lawrence was his instructor. And he said, like, he was great. He was so smart and blah, blah, blah. And then, you know, everyone at school knew that I would just go around telling people that I came to Pratt because of Jacob Lawrence. And finally, they gave an award ceremony for Jacob Lawrence.
Okay.
And he and his wife, Gwendolyn, came to Pratt. Oh. And of course, they said, you have to be the usher for Jacob Lawrence and his wife.
Yeah.
And so I hung out with them all day, and I was so quiet because I was just, and also they were at a certain age where they needed assistance from getting around. So I basically walked with both of them in my arms, like down the steps, through the hallway.
Oh my God.
And
did you tell him?
he knew. I told everybody knew that I came there for him. Like, everyone that knows me know that.
You were like a stand for Jacob Lawrence.
Yeah, like and the thing is, the thing that really drew me to his work, not only, first it was the visual and the way that he used color, but at that time I was still a young artist, probably like 19, and I didn't even start painting yet, but I was just so drawn. But what really blew me away is that when I found the book and I was looking through the pages and I was so drawn, I think it was maybe the migration book, it was a small book. When I flipped to the back of the book, it was a picture, I didn't know it was who he was. When I flipped to the back of the book, it was a picture of him as a young person with a pipe. And I was like, who is this black guy? Like, he's in his 20s. He had a pipe, he had like a little tie. I was like, I want to be that. I said, I want to be that guy. And so I was just like really.
Wait, so now I'm thinking of your bio shot at the beginning.
So then I just started trying, just looking for him. Like, I was like, asking people about him, and I was just really interested in him as a person. And I finally got to meet him, and he was amazing. Yeah, he was great.
Just endless stories here with you, Derrick. That's a beautiful story. So I want to go to another image. So we're thinking about the three-dimensionality and the kind of like constantly being invoked in your work. So performance art obviously is a big, that was also part of your your early, ongoing practice, but your early practice. So do you want to talk a bit about the ways in which, and I love the way the show is curated because it's not chronological. And it's not based on medium, but based on the conversation you're having with yourself across mediums. So, you can go into a room and you can see, like the way I've broken it up, it's around the kind of themes I'm interested in, but we can see the interplay that you're having, right, with yourself and being, you can see the geometric stuff here, but also the performance. So let's talk a little bit about you as a performance artist.
Oh, yeah.
And how that, again, because I guess hopefully by the end of this conversation, everyone will see how all of these things have the aesthetic. Is like Beyonce's like it's a Beyonce album, but like there's like a country album's a Beyonce album. Like there's a Derrick Adams aesthetic that you have singularly created, and we can see them across different mediums and different modalities. So what's going on here with not going here, but what do you see the relationship between the kind of performance-based work, your early and now painting and photography for you as well?
Well, when I started out before I even went to grad school, I was making like kind of like installation, experimental work. I just was just making it because I wasn't even thinking, I didn't have a plan. Like, I didn't say like, I'm gonna do this and get there. I knew I wanted to do video because I didn't have money to have a studio. So I'm like, what can artists who don't have a studio make? You gotta think like that. Like, if you're creative, not having a studio should not stop you from making work. Like, the idea that drives your work is the conceptual framework that pushes the work forward for people to see. So if you live in a small space, your show can be about living in a small space. Like, it's not, when artists say, like, I need a big room so I can make I'm like, that's not really necessarily about being creative. That's really more about wanting something that you don't have right now. And so I started doing performance. I bought a nanny cam from Dwayne Reed. Yeah, I was walking past Dwayne Reed in downtown Brooklyn, and I saw like a white little nanny cam in the window, and I was like, what's that? And it had like a little monitor, and it was like cordless and all that. And I said, I'm going to buy that. And so I started to make a whole body of work about surveillance, but surveilling myself. So I would do these videos where I would like walk outside. I would do all these different things. I would wear costumes, different things. I think one thing was like the day in the life of a superhero. And I like walked around outside with like a cape on and with some underwear, and I was like a mask on. And then I made like all these different sculptures out of sneakers that I had. I repurposed certain things and make like this kind of makeshift superhero gear. And I applied to grad school, Columbia, and I got in instantly. They was like, oh my God, who is this person? You know.
Is that what you submitted as part of your materials?
Yeah.
Okay.
They were just like, Derrick, they're like, we really want you, like, you know. And I didn't feel like.
And you've had a prolific career as a curator.
Yeah. So I was curating. I was curating.
But did people not know this other side?
They didn't know that. They didn't know that. And so when I did this thing, which was really makeshift, using this nanny cam, it was like VHS. So I had to do like VHS to VHS to edit it. And it was like, you know, it was very like analog. And I did this body of work, and it was interesting because I got into grad school. And then, so I never thought about like, I didn't even think about like a bigger, I was thinking more like an alternative space maybe showing, or like some space that's not like a regular gallery space. Because I just thought that that was my lane. Like I was gonna just do whatever. And then the way I started venturing into like more gallery representation is when I was in 2005, I started showing with a gallery called Jack Tilton Gallery, and it was in Soho, and it was right before they moved to Upper East Side. And I was doing performance and video, and I was doing some stuff. And of course, you know, the show didn't sell. And he told me, he was like, listen, I sell work in the back so I can show artists like you who are doing things that's interesting and people aren't gonna buy. You might sell one piece. We might sell one piece, and we probably have to give someone a discount, he said. He said, but I believe in what you're doing, so that's why I'm showing your work there. But he didn't tell me to change my work to make it sellable. But the way that I started to get more into the commercial world, I left working with Jack Tilton for a while, and I started working with this newer gallerist, Colette Blanchard, a young black woman who had a gallery on the Lower East Side, and I had a show with her in 2010, which were the brick sculpture pieces. And when we didn't sell anything again. Like people came by, people were looking at stuff. When people tell me they didn't sell anything, I'm like, I don't even care. I'm like, I made the work, I'm gonna be broke, that's the work, you know? I would get write-ups all the time when I would make work. People always say like, this new artist is doing the cool stuff, you gotta look out for him. You know, I would always get, but when I got a little write-up in Village Voice, my show at Jack Tilton, he was very pessimistic. So he would say, I got a mention in Village Voice. He was like, yeah, but no picture. Like he would never say like, that's great, you know?
Yeah. So it's not encouraging.
So it was kind of cool that he was like that because it kept me very grounded working with him. But the gallery, Colette Blanchard told me, you know, because we weren't selling anything, and she was a new gallery, and I was one of the artists that was working with her, and she said, we got to figure out how to sell your work. And she said, I don't want you to do anything to make your work sellable. It's my job to figure out what part of your practice as a performance artist that we could sell that will not compromise what you do. And she said, we need to start maybe taking photographs of what you're doing and having the photographer, we hire photographers to photograph, we do audition, or we do something where you still can keep doing the experimental things you're doing without feeling like you have to like make something that's sellable. And so I was making the performance and the sculpture, and then I started to get more in the photography part because I started being more in control of overstaging and doing video and film and stuff like that. So and when I was at Columbia, I studied film theory, and so I was really interested in like how to really frame my image and the performances that I was doing. So it was really like people were there to kind of usher me into a space without telling me to change what I was doing.
Yeah. So, I mean, I thought this was interesting because we're returning, like this idea of kind of engaging your former self and then reactivating it in another manner, another medium. So here we have playthings again. And they're interacting with each other. And then also this idea of the kind of domestic and the interior spaces. That's part of like the kind of thematic of the show. And I think we also see it here with I just want to get to some of the themes that the green book.
Yeah.
Right. So, and also because later on we're going to talk about your public art work. This idea of kind of bringing in us, the viewer, into the interior spaces of Black life. Is that something that you feel like is important to you? I mean, we have people outside, but then you have a lot of interior, intimate spaces that you then share with the world. And I'm curious for you, is that a important part of your practice? I know a lot of the collage work that you originally did also kind of played with like, we talked about like the vinyl that your grandparents or that your family used, like the shelf liner?
Yeah, it became the collage things that I use, because a lot of times I think about how domestic decor operated, and as a person, just generationally, I remember I was born in 1970, so I remember like it was more common when you think about renovating, that everyone just put shelf liner on the kitchen counter. And that was a big deal. And also they would go to Joann Fabric to like find the right curtains to go for different seasons. So I would just notice my grandmother doing this every year. It was like the Thanksgiving curtains, the summer curtains, the whatever. And I realized as I matured how inexpensive that renovation was, but how much it represented not how much money you had, but how much you cared about your space. And so I thought about that so every time I'm lost when it comes to economy, when I'm thinking about material, I always think that if you're creative, you could use anything. You can use, when you're teaching elementary school, you use popsicle sticks, you're using milk cartons, you're using all these different things. I'm like, so that should never leave your creative spirit as an artist. And so I started thinking about how to use those same techniques to make art at a higher level. And so that's where the contact paper came. But I always go back to thinking about the people in my family, especially the women in my family, in the way that they dealt with color and they dealt with certain things. And I grew up in church. So the thing I remember the most was not even church. I remember getting ready for church. Like, I grew up with a lot of women in my family. So I remember my aunts and my mother, if they, for instance, they had like a green, back then everyone wore like monochromatic stuff. So I remember my aunts, they would have, like if we would go to my aunt's house and my aunt was looking for a pair of pantyhose that match a dress, she would bring that over to your house. And she would say, this is a dress I bought. If you're out and about and you see some blue pantyhose, please get them for me, I'll give you the money back. And so I grew up in that type of family where the women, it was 8 sisters, and so they would just be out in the mall with their kids, and they were on the phone like, I found those shoes you were looking for. I found the whatever. Is it right? You wanted off-white. This is the off-white you wanted. I grew up in that type of very aware of like color tone, and and so that just kind of became part of my understanding of looking at color now, like how warm, cold. Like growing up in church, also they would say like, you want to have a white blouse, and that blouse is not white. That blouse is off-white. Everyone else, that looks dingy. Everyone else is wearing white. Oh, that's navy blue, what are you black? You know? And so as a kid, you become aware of like color. You become aware of like certain things that most people don't think about as it relates to like being a part of a group or being a part. So as an artist, that always kind of played a part in my understanding of color. And
well, that's why like when I wrote the essay on you, because I heard some of these stories and I was like, okay, so you talked about being in grad school, and obviously there's a kind of pressure to represent Black life in a particular way, and that what you were realizing is that you were kind of foregrounded in, or you were steeped in a Black aesthetic tradition. But the Black aesthetic tradition was these conversations that your aunts were having around color or the shelf liner. And I think it's really important. And for me, who grew up also working class in Boston and then later in New Jersey, it's like there's a way in which maybe with music, we think that there's a Black working class aesthetic that creates the blues or hip hop, but that in visual culture, we somehow think that it has to be the inspiration or the aesthetic training doesn't come from these Black working class communities, these conversations that black middle class and working class communities, these conversations, the church we don't think of as like a formative site for a visual artist. And so I just love the way in which you invoke that. The other thing I remember you talking about, and I don't know if it made it into the essay, is like just symmetry. Like when Black people talk about like haircuts, right? Like the fade, the line.
Yeah, like, the line is crooked.
Yeah, yeah.
Or you have or your pants has a crooked crease.
Yeah, but the way that we see that your geometric.
Like all of those things, you know, like
exactly.
like the idea of things being balanced, even if it's not a very illogical reason, but it has to do with an aesthetic of how you are being presented to whoever the audience is. So like thinking about like your hairline or thinking about your crease in your pants or those type of things. Again, like I grew up in this environment with very strong women, and that's what they talked about. Like they really cared about those type of things as well as the other professionals.
As an aesthetic standard.
Yes, like they were all professionals in their field of work.
Yeah.
But when it came to like presentation, we were very hyper conscious of things.
Yeah.
You know, like if certain people wore like a color that, like, why would they wear that shoe with that pants? Like, that's just totally like a wrong, I'm like, I was a kid, so me and my cousin, we would always laugh about that, but that's something that kind of built into our ideas of like, it wasn't even about what was appropriate or not was appropriate, because now as an artist, I'm like, that actually look,
the
like,
off color.
Yeah, they hated like people who wore rust and red.
Yeah.
But that was like a thing in my family.
Like,
why do you wear those rust shoes with that red dress? That don't look good. Like I'm like, I look at that now as an artist, like that looks really great.
Yeah.
Like, you know, but back then it was like you're not following the code of like style. So I always thought about that, you know, just as and my cousin and I would laugh about that growing up. But as an artist looking back for inspiration, I always go back to thinking about them, thinking about those things, and also thinking about what I've learned in the academic setting that I also incorporate with my work formally.
Yeah.
And those two things together, I think, gives me enough like interest to occupy my mind. So a lot of times when I'm making things, it's really just me working out issues or things that I'm issues and formal issues mostly of how to make sense of the things that I've been able to absorb over my lifetime to put it back into the world and really talk about the aesthetic principles that I think are associated with Black culture, but also as it relates to the broader ecosystem of American culture, because there's a lot of influences from very different things, but a lot of the influences are really starting from modernism with jazz, which is, you know, kind of one of the origin of modernism in this country, but also a lot of different things that allude to, you know, you look at an old movie from the 50s or whatever, you would hear jazz. Or you would hear the editing kind of go with the jazz. Like, you know, you see it was so much more complex than I thought about watching it as a kid. I look at a lot of things as an adult in a more analytical way. And so that becomes like more of the merger of all the things that I put together in the work.
So one of the things, I'm just having these two figures look at each other, and then this is the work that I have in my house. They're separate, but also this idea of the Black gaze, which Tina Kemp talks about the Black gaze, but that, to me, what's also striking, given the stories that you just told, are like the kind of standard of artistic inspiration and aspiration are the ways in which it's like an internal one, the way in which Black people understand each other, relate to each other, and then have a kind of practice and a code and a judgment, or sort of, you know, we think about like aesthetic theory in particular ways, and then this is an underwritten, I think, but highly experienced if you grew up in these communities. And so that's one of the things I just want to appreciate. And then is this your aunt?
Well, so a lot of the works that I use, they have like a fantastical presence to them.
Sorry, it's not your aunt.
Yeah, but a lot of them are coming from, a lot of them are coming from real images that we have. So this particular painting that's called Be the Table was my aunt at Halloween. So this is actually from a real photograph of one of my aunts, because my family, we would have my family is so big, like my mom is like 11 of them. And each one of my grandfather and all of his siblings had like 11 or 12 kids. So it's like so it's like a lot of people. But every year we would rent like a community hall to host our family Halloween party. It was just our family. nobody else. And so we would have like a contest. We had the best costumes, stuff like that. We would give out a prize and all that. And it would be multi-generational, it'd be older people, younger people, but it was just our family. And my aunt, she came as a table. So she had like a cardboard thing around her neck. She had a tablecloth. She had a little fake cake around the thing. She had the hat and everything. So I painted it. I mean, it all started during a lot of the images that I started to make probably in 2018, 2019, were from my family group text. Like a lot of people have family group texts that really happened around pandemic time, where people started dropping images of like old photographs, like, oh, look, I found this photograph when we were doing it. So my family started doing that. And I was like, wow, this is really great source imagery. So my family started dropping all these photos of our family in this group, and I started saving a lot of the photographs. So I painted some of them as family portraits, and they were oil paintings that I've shown, and they're in the show. And then I started to pull the ones that were more exaggerated, that I thought people wouldn't even believe this to be something that really happened. I started to incorporate that in my work, and this particular style of painting, which I can kind of go back and forth sometimes. But these are basically 3 of my aunts, but the main subject is my aunt with the table, and she's funny. She was like, "Do I get a commission?" So use my picture. I said, "You didn't even know it was you. Get out of here. You didn't even know." But yeah, so
But I remember seeing it in your studio when I came to interview, and I was just so struck that there's this one and another one I'll show later on.
Yeah.
But I was just so struck by the story, and then also just seeing your practice of like the relationship between the kind of the photograph that's approximating reality, and then the ways in which you are formally kind of exaggerating, but also like getting us to reorient. Like the use of color, the different tonality, the women looking at each other. I mean, all of this, and that's just like a theme I see in your work of, like I said, the Black gaze, but it's like a kind of group. It's people looking at each other across.
And I was thinking too, like a lot of the work was really more about, okay, when I started really thinking more intellectually about what was I trying to say, or what was I trying to do with my work, I started to realize that as an artist, the most successful works I found as artists is when people are able to look at a photograph and that photograph moves you in some way. And what's happening in that photograph has some type of emotional pull. That an artist who understands not the object itself, but what's happening, should be able to transfer that same level of emotion and response through a sculpture. Or they should be able to do that as a painting. Like, what you're moved by is not necessarily the object itself. You're moved by what the object is doing to you. And so that's what you want to capture when you make an artwork. You don't want to duplicate what someone else is doing, because that is just copying the formal elements of something. The reason why you liked that thing was not because of what it looked like, it's because of what it made you feel like when you saw it. And so that's the goal for an artist, to be able to translate something that made you feel a certain way into something to make another person feel how you felt when you saw that thing. And they may not even know that you were looking at something or what you were looking at, but that's not important. The most important part is that you were able to pull from that viewer what pulled you into what you were looking at. And to me, that's helped me a lot as an artist to transition into different object making.
Interesting. And try to convey that in different, like.
Yeah, and I thought this was so outrageous.
It seems like a challenge.
And when she came into the room, we were like blown away. Like, she walked in and she had a table on. It was like a little thing. It was like, and we were like, what? Everyone was like, what? Like, you won. They're like, you won. And so, so I never forgot it. And even my aunts are surprised at things I remember. My family members, as a grown-up, and I might recall certain things that I remember. They're like, you remember that? And I'm like, yeah, I remember that, And they're surprised that I was paying attention, but it's because everyone was so colorful in their personality that I felt like, as an adult, like I have so much information that they left me with by just living their own lives, that I could just use all of this information, but also attach it to other historical things that I've also learned in the academic setting, to talk about values that I think are important, that are aligned with other values that I was taught to be interested in because of its association with the academic environment. Yeah,
so I mean, this is stunning. So you took the 3D-ness of it all, and then And so in thinking about growing up, so here I'm just going to show two different ways in which and then if you obviously came into this building, you can see the way in which the color bar, is it SMPTE? Is that what they call it? Is that how they say it? I don't know. Okay. So we grew up, I'm a 75, you're 70. So we grew up like TV going off at like 11 o'clock or something. Yeah. And it'd be like, and then you would have these like, sorry.
And then it'd get fuzzy. It would go like, and then it'll get fuzzy.
Yeah.
You know.
So wait, it's just, I mean, so you know, if someone like me, I just take that for granted as part of my memory bank. But this is a source of like, I mean, you're thinking about television, you take Technicolor, you're thinking about commercialism, you think about nostalgia. So and here you have like a fabric collage. Then you're also here, you have like, I mean, you're just
like a poncho, yeah.
But you're also like, it's a television show.
Well, that was really interesting. But I
just want to show like the breadth of and then you actually have like painting. So there's so much going on with the technical. Okay, go ahead.
Well, the whole broadcast thing. Well, for me as an artist, when I grew up, I was really into like the Electric Company, Sesame Street. I was one of those kids who would like sing to the shows, you know, stand in front of the television. I was really interested in like at that particular time. I'm looking at it in retrospect. It was really the beginning of like how people think about reality television. That the person that's behind the camera is actually aware that you're here, that they see you. And as a kid, that was very exciting because I felt that I was being entertained as well as the kids who were in these sets. And so when the color bar would come on, usually, you know, I wasn't always up late enough for that, but when it did come on, I just automatically, as a kid, thought about it being like a curtain. Not like they're still there, but this is a curtain, and they're doing stuff behind the curtain, but you just don't have access to the curtain. So I just thought that as a kid, I just thought that it wasn't going off, it was just going behind the scenes as a.
But that makes me think of your Wiz stuff too, right? Yeah. Like because of the wizards behind the curtain. I'm sorry to interject.
I just thought you know. The idea of the broadcast was also projecting, but also was the idea of concealing. And so that was just something that I thought about, and that's how the fabric pieces kind of came about because it became like a curtain. Yeah. And then this particular piece with the puppet was at BAM when they first opened their Fisher building, and they asked me to do a performance, but I first did it at the kitchen, another performance called Go Stand Next to the Mountain that's at the museum. This was the second piece called The Channel. And this actual Muppet, which is funny, I made this Muppet from leggings at Target and a foam head and then like a little, what you call like one of those small like scrunchy afro things you buy from the hair supply shop. So I just made this up in my studio. That's what I thought art was. I thought art was just like, if you're creative, show me. If you're creative, you can do it. And so I just made this Muppet, thinking that I was just going to make it. I have a couple of them in my studio where I just make different things. And so this Muppet actually is a historical Muppet. It's based on a real Muppet called Franklin Roosevelt, who was a Sesame Street star, only for 1 year, 1975 to 1976. You can watch him on YouTube, but he was like a socially conscious political puppet who would educate people about like black culture in the classroom. And he had like an album. He was like one of the Muppets that had his own album. He was very popular, but he only aired for 1 year. So this piece was called the Resurrection of Roosevelt Franklin. So I recreated this Muppet to appear like the other one, but I also created a whole, with this composer, artist friend of mine, Ramon Silva, we did like a whole score. But the performance was, I created a large entertainment center. And the television, which we don't have an image of it, when people came in, like I never like to like come out on the stage while people are in front. I would always be inside of a sculpture that's in front, on the stage. Because I didn't want to leave the stage during my performance. I wanted to be in the space the whole time. So I built this whole structure, and in the middle of the structure, it was this thing that's on, this color bar was a backdrop. And it had a hole in the middle, like a slice. And the performance started when I pushed my head through the thing, and it detached from the thing, and I had the puppet in my hand. And the performance started like that. And so people were there, they didn't know I was even on the sculpture until I pushed my head out of the slit, and then it became part of the costuming for the performance.
Wow. I'm sorry I missed this. I didn't even know about the
sometimes
puppet.
people are like, how do you think of that? What's going on in your brain?
The Muppet,
I'm like,
the
I don't
racially
know.
conscious Muppet. There's so much, and the technical. So I want to, this idea of, it's another way of thinking about your work, projection and concealment, and the wigs, right? So here I want us to move us from like kind of domestic, even in consuming television as being this kind of, moment in which the outside comes inside the home, to going outside with your work. And I think the wigs are both a way of getting us to think about Black women in public spaces. The wigs for you are this moment of like concealment and projection simultaneously. And I saw this also when I came to your studio. I just kind of fell in love with this work as well. And we can see the bricks continuously being evoked here. So this is a prominent feature of more of your work, more recent work, even in the show that I think that you did in Korea with like wigs. So how are you thinking about the, not evolution, but the kind of maybe the expansion to include these exterior, this is a store, correct?
Yeah, like a storefront.
Storefront.
I mean, I just started to realize like, I really loved doing performance when I started off as my early career, but I didn't consider myself a performance artist because most people I know who are performance artists like to be in public, like to be visible. And I only felt like I had to do performance because certain things had to be performed and certain things do not have to be performed. So I didn't feel that I was in the same category of other artists who consider themselves performance artists, because most of them honestly were very performance. And I was never really that type of person. I just liked doing performance art when it was time to do it. And so when I started thinking about myself as an artist and like how to sustain myself, I thought like, can you still talk about performance with a stagnant object? Can you still talk about performance with a photograph? Can you talk about performance with a sculpture? Can the sculpture be performative? Can a painting be performative? And so I realized that the challenge would be how to capture performative gestures in something that's not moving. And so the paintings kind of came out of being drawn to things that are part of a relational aesthetic, of how people assume the engagement of this object is supposed to respond or supposed to activate the person's understanding of the object in space. And so a lot of the things I was interested in became things that were part of the history of performative actions. And so the beauty shop, to me, I live in Bed-Stuy, and you get off the train, and it's not even just in Bed-Stuy. I started photographing every inner city that I would go to in Paris, London, Milan. I would go to the areas that were like the wig shops. And primarily anywhere you go was either like an African hairstylist, braider, or it was always usually a person of color in the places I would go to document. But I realized how these spaces were actually exhibition spaces. They weren't just like a transactional space. They were actually giving people some insight in cultural norms, in cultural exchange. And so I just started photographing it because I'm like, this is actually, I just left a museum and now I'm in a museum now, but this museum is free. So I'm walking down and I'm hearing people talk to each other. I'm seeing like, changing it out. I'm seeing different things. I started photographing it just out of visual. I didn't know it was going to be a work. I just started to photograph it. And then I started photographing hundreds and hundreds of images when I was traveling, doing other work. And then eventually I decided to start painting them. But it started off just documenting things, but I also realized like in most urban spaces, most spaces that are occupied by Black people, that our practices are public. Our social practices, we usually things are glass. We can see in, we can see people communicating with each other. We can see a lot of different things, even if you had no necessary interaction with us. You can get a sense of how we communicate with each other just by looking, or you can have some assumption from looking. And I thought, to me, that was the performative part, but how to convey this sense of like the value part through an aesthetic exaltation, through kind of pulling things out from what it, like some things, sometimes people do things that they don't think are special. They just do it. And my job is to let you know, actually, it's a little bit turned up. Like you don't, like you're doing something that should be like in this other space.
Yeah.
So when you see it,
Yeah.
it gives you a certain level of understanding that the things that you are participating in is a value contribution to culture and culture society. And I said the same thing with the brickworks. Like when you go into a lot of cities, like when you travel around the world and you go to like Venice or Milan or whatever places and you see a ruin, you fantasize of, you have a fantasy of it being important. But American people don't think that. When they see a place that has blight or abandoned building, we think about blight. We don't think like, who lived there? Like, who was a teacher there? Was a scientist living there? Was a postal worker living there? We don't think like that. We think like, oh my God, look at this neighborhood. It's just a mess. But when you go to Europe, you're like, oh, look at this beautiful ruined house. Like, it's like two bricks on the street, and it's amazing. Like, you know, we don't have the same level of value system for things that existed prior to us being there.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, and I start to think about that as an artist. Like, we need to turn our perspective of what is valuable.
Yeah.
Like, people don't have to do anything for you to be valuable.
Yeah.
Like, people existed, people lived there, people loved there, people had kids. Like, every abandoned house has a history. And if anything, you should maybe want to Google the address when you get where you're going and Google who may have lived there. Because I've noticed in New York, in Brooklyn, I would Google an address and there might have been a famous pianist who lived in there, or a scientist, or something. Like, a lot of houses have history, and I think that I just learned for myself not to underestimate that. Because one day I was driving the car with my mom in Baltimore, which has a lot of, you know, abandoned buildings in some areas, and I was like, look at all these abandoned buildings. She was like, listen, don't be coming back here talking about this Baltimore. Don't come back. Stay in New York. Like, this is my city. It used to be your city. So if you don't like it, you could go back to where you came from. And so I was like, oh, okay. So she's one who got me straight. She got me straight. So my ideas are really thinking about the way she saw, because she would say, oh, you know, my friends who live here, used to be a doctor live there, different people live there.
Yeah.
So I became more aware just having that environment of support around me.
Yeah, it's also just, I mean, these things are all tied to like race, and at least in America, like what's blighted versus what's valuable. I mean, in the way in which Black life is so devalued, so you're offering us like an opportunity to like correct that as well. So I just want to, because I want to open up to the audience. So you now are in public with your work, meaning, and I know it's always in public, but you're making public. Well, this is not necessarily public art, but this is kind of like, it's considered pop art. I just want to go through the ways in which you're, again, in conversation with yourself, right? Because there's like the black unicorn, then there's a painting of the black unicorn. There's
that's the African American Museum behind there in the back. And
that's so cool.
And this playground wallpaper that's in the back is from the show
we did together.
Yeah. At the National Mall.
On the National Mall. So Derrick, who was like, you know, I'm gonna confess something. There are artists that we got to pick. Me and Paul were negotiating. You were the artist that I picked. So I was like, I don't know what Derrick's gonna do, but he's gonna do something fabulous. So we had asked 6 artists to answer the question, what are the untold stories on the National Mall? And you came up with a playground. I think this is like if you have gone to the National Mall, children are like forlorn, like walking up those steps to Abraham Lincoln.
They hate it.
They hate it. It's like torture. And you created this playground, and there's no, even though there's places for leisure, there aren't places for play per se. I mean, people do ultimate frisbee or something, but you created a playground what I love about this is also the way in which, and you can see here, like it was grayscale on one side and color, rainbow whiz like on the other side, that you took a photograph of the first desegregated playground in Washington, D.C. 1958, and that was the inspiration and the image, right? So you're able to take these kind of like complicated historical moments of optimism, but also a tragic history of segregation, but then also encourage us to play. And that's like seems to be such an important part of your practice, and it's also one of the more innovative and inventive aspects that you're bringing to contemporary art, I think, now. So you want to say anything, and then I'll just open up to the audience?
Well, that idea of play became a central part of my philosophy coming out of undergrad as an art education major. But I had the privilege of reading this book called, and I can't even find it anymore, but it wasn't even a book. My professor printed it out. You know, back in the day, they would just print out everything on Xerox, so you didn't have to buy it. It was called The Politics of Play. And I remember reading the book, and it totally changed my perspective of how to use my creative, I guess, impulse in making things that, because the playground became such a site of political and social political engagement. And it's really a small world for kids. And what happens at the playground really is a representation of not only the individual, but the person that gave birth to that person. And so it's a very interesting thing to really look at as a very representation of a larger society. So I like to start with play because play is something that everyone has some attachment to, but how it's constructed is based on a bigger picture of architectural framework that is very, and this is what happened with the piece. We had to be conscious of, like, at the time it was because of the pandemic and COVID, so we had to make everything, things that were really close in the playground became really broad because everything had to be 6 feet apart. And that's how playgrounds are now being built, with that same concept in mind that kind of ushered in after the pandemic. But I started to really think about play as a construct, but also a way of kind of neutralizing certain tensions that people may have, and also seeing kids act out things that sometimes their parents discover about them when they're in a space with other kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Okay, I'm going to open it up to people. We have like about 10 minutes or so. I'm going to get to a title slide. Just.
I think we'll have time for 2 questions.
Okay, that's fine. 2 questions. That
Okay.
sounds like it's 2 questions. I can't really see people. Do you see people? It's hard to see the hands here. Do you see hands?
Okay.
It's like
Cool.
light. Do you see hands? Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I noticed one of the pieces, I think the wig piece, the title is Groove Theory, parentheses, Tell Me.
Oh, yeah.
So, like, that's an all-time favorite song for me. So, shout out to all my 90s girls in here. So I was just curious about, like, your relationship with music and, you know, there's something you're drawing in here, and just, like, music and correlation to your work.
When I'm making my work, when I get to the titles, I try not to make the titles too didactic, because what I really love is for people to reveal their interpretation of my work, because I also use that as a form of educating myself on the way my work is responded to by people. And so I try to think about things that will allow the work to exist in a way that I can actually build on it myself by having people interact with it in many different levels. In sound and music, most artists listen to music in their studio all the time. I'm a really big music person right now. You know, I've always has been, but like in my studio, music is always playing. I'm always singing in my studio. Matter of fact, one of my friends, who's one of my close friends now, when we first met, his studio was below my studio when I was out of grad school, and we never met each other. But when he finally met me, he's like, "Are you the guy upstairs singing all the time? Like, you're always singing." I said, "Do I sound good?" And he said, "Yeah." You know, so music is always a really good, a good motivator in my studio, because when I'm working, sometimes I'm singing or whatever. But I also think that a lot of the music I listen to has socio-political relationship when it comes to either dealing with community or what's happening in the world. So all of those works from that series are all named after girl bands or girl groups, R&B. And so a lot of them are like, you know, Total or, you know, SWV or, you know, so it's really fun. Yeah, thank you, yeah. One right here in the front, yeah. Oh, no, right here. Yeah, are you still in the question or no?
Hi.
Oh.
Hi. I just think what you talked about today, and after having seen your show, there is just a joy in the space, in all the spaces. And so many different, it was so great hearing you talk about the contact paper. I remember doing that and I'm much older than you. We had contact paper in the 50s, you know?
Yeah.
And that, especially the one that looked like wood grain, and you could fix up your house that way, or a shelf, or you could cover the back of your TV with it. You know, you could do anything.
Everything.
And I think there is just, you're so connected to your childhood, your family. I love the Black family, that richness, and you've expressed it in such a joyful way, and you're so smart, but it's so accessible too. I just love hearing you talk, because it's just a wonderful combination of your wonderful education, but so much is in you that you're bringing out. And what you said about how you look at a work of art, because I had a friend who looked at something in my house, she said, well, I could do that. You know, it's like the line that maybe Picasso did, a simple drawing. Well, I could do that. You know, I could sit down, and the answer is, but you didn't.
Yeah,
you know,
you did, exactly.
Because you don't feel it.
And
you're feeling it for all of us. It's just a joy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think that was a nice.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, nice way to end.
And thank you everyone for being here. I greatly appreciate your presence. I see one of my really good friends here in the crowd, amazing artist, Jason from undergrad at Pratt. So thank you everybody. Thank you for being here.